Okay. Apologies, we can't now see anyone. We're talking to the abyss.
Cool. So I'll make a start, and then I'll hand over to Katie to go through the content. Firstly, thank you for taking some time to listen to us today. We want to use this time both to explain a bit about the way that we see expert judgment and elicitation being used in the pharmaceutical industry, but also selfishly, we quite want to use this as an opportunity to hear from you in some of the spaces where we are identifying that there are challenges or more complex issues that we need to deal with in this space. And so what we'll do is we'll give a brief overview of the way that we see that expert judgment and elicitation are used currently, the common areas where it is applied in an R&D setting. Now, I will say that there are other places in organisation like ours where expert judgment is obviously used, but we will kind of focus very much in the R&D setting and the progression of pharmaceutical assets. And then after that, we'll talk about some of the areas where we see kind of the expansion of scope of how expert judgment is being used. And then finally, some of the challenges and complexities that we see, which we're looking to address. Both Katie and I are here today, not speaking on behalf of GSK, but actually speaking on behalf of kind of the industry and common trends that we see. And as we're going through some of the information, we'll describe where we see differences between different companies in the way that they are approaching some of these common problems that you see. So with that in mind, if we just scroll over to the next screen, if we start at a very high level, why expert judgment is important. If you think about the way that drug development happens as a process, it's one where there's a lot of unknowns, there's a lot of uncertainty. Almost by definition, you're doing something novel and new. But there's also very high stakes. There's very high stakes from an organizational and a cost perspective, and there's also a very high stakes from a human perspective in terms of patients ultimately are impacted by the drug development process, and so we need to think about all of these things as we're assessing how our drugs will progress. Obviously, a large pharma company like the sort of company that we work at, or our peers, manage a portfolio of assets, and the majority of these will fail to reach the market. In fact, a very small proportion of assets actually make it through the entire process and make it onto the market, and Katie will go on to describe some numbers around that to give you an idea of the sort of scale that we're talking about. So one element that's key for us is about how do we understand the risk profile of our drugs as they are going through this pipeline of activity to support sound decision making. And this is true both for kind of the individual project teams, who are teams that are set up to manage that drug or medicine as it goes through the pipeline, but also for kind of above project activities, so portfolio management, as in the space that we work, or other organizational things. And so key risks that it's important to understand as we're going through that is obviously we need to understand this for the purpose of optimizing our trial design. We need to understand this from a resourcing and budgeting, how much we're expecting to be in the pipeline at any given point, given the amount of risk that there is. And also from a prioritization perspective to understand, how can we best improve people's lives and kind of support company growth. We need to understand the risks that exist behind our drugs as they're progressing. And so we use elicitation as a key tool to help quantify some of that complex information about a new drug and the risks, and therefore the portfolio as a whole.
Yeah. Okay, so when talking about that risk profile, that's where elicitation plays a really key role for us, as it's often considering multiple factors and risks across the project that's being worked on. As David mentioned, to give you a sense, if you're not familiar with the pharmaceutical industry, on the right-hand side here, there's an image of some of the key steps to develop a new medicine, from drug discovery, where you're looking to find the right target in the body, and then you start screening compounds to see if they will bind to that target. And then you can get a sense at the bottom of how long that time frame is. And then as you move further right into the preclinical space, so this is when you're testing in the labs, you're doing in vivo and in vitro assessments, starting to look at safety and efficacy. You can see that attrition is really starting to come through, of how many compounds at this point will make it into then the orange phase of the clinic. This is when we go into a human for the first time. And is when we really start looking at, in a human, is the compound safe and efficacious? And ultimately, we're trying to get to the regulatory approval space on the far right-hand side. So it gives you a sense of just how much attrition we expect to see in the pharma industry and the amount of risk and the number of points at which the drugs could fall down. So when we talk about risk, we might talk about probability of success, or if we're being more specific, the phrase of probability of technical and regulatory success, or PTRS. So this is really describing what's the chance of a molecule getting through all these phases that it has ahead of it and making it through a successful regulatory approval, be that with the FDA or EMA. So what does that look like in practice? Well, it boils down to quite a simple case of multiplication from the math side, but really the values underlying it are the pieces where we need to rely quite often on elicitation. So for example, if we have a drug that's currently in the phase 2 space, so we've gone into humans and now we're wanting to see a sign of efficacy in patients, we'd have a probability of that phase succeeding. So here, 45%. That is going to be coming through in a series of different ways that we could come up with that number that I'll take you through on the next slide. But just to get you through the idea, then for phase 3, we need to make sure our peers are thinking about conditional probabilities. That conditional on being successful in phase 2, what's the chance of us achieving success in phase 3? And likewise, in the regulatory space, conditional on achieving success in phase 3 and phase 2. And so the advantage then of having the conditional, we can then multiply through to get a joint probability to get an overall sense of the risk in that project right now. Okay, so how do we do this? There really is no set way. It's varying across drugs, across companies, across the phase at which you're operating in and the time available. So I've broken this down to give you a sense of what kind of knowledge is out there for us to form these judgments on, what approaches are being used and we're seeing across industry, and who are those people making those assessments as well, because that's not even a fixed point. So just to put a bit of colour on these rows then, so for the knowledge, we've got things like the competitive data. How good is Pfizer's drug in a certain indication? Is it similar from how it is it's operating in the body to ours? Does it tell us some knowledge and useful information? Drug characteristics might be as simple as, is it an oral or is it an IV drug, as they have quite different safety profiles. We also have a really good database of, if you like, historical success rates across indications, which are known as benchmarks. So historically, across major pharma companies, what's the chance of succeeding in rheumatoid arthritis, for example? Then you might have more specific information to the work you've done in-house already, in the labs or in earlier clinical trials if you're at that phase, and the specifics of the phase that you're in at the moment, so a specific trial design. And then looking and judging all that information, you've got different approaches. It might be something as quick and simple as taking that industry benchmark and using that directly and hoping that it reasonably represents the risk in your program. You might work with individuals, either a project team working on the drug or external experts, to judge the probability directly. So do an elicitation on the probability value itself. Or what you might see is we are seeing in statistics departments, they're trying to link our belief in our ability to have an effect on a particular endpoint, perhaps the primary endpoint of a trial, and linking that to the trial design to get a probability. So here I've put the elicitation of an observable, and by that I mean what's the size of effect we would expect to see, a reduction on the pain scale, for example, if we're working on a new medicine for pain. So getting those experts to think in terms of a tangible endpoint, and then using that distribution of belief with the trial design to give an estimate of chance of hitting the trial success criteria on that pain scale. And then on the right hand side, sometimes we see almost a move away from using expert judgment and something completely analytical. But perhaps when you're in a space with a lot of disease knowledge already, or a lot of drugs already approved, you might be able to build up some distribution of potential effects you might see purely from metadata across the industry. And then the who is involved, I think, is a really interesting question. So I've seen and spoken to peers about this. So you've got the decision makers, the people that own the keys to the cash, if you like, across R&D. They are often used as the ultimate decision maker of what the level of risk should be, the appropriate value. You may also have the project teams giving their view and assessment of risk in the project. If it's an area which is new to your business, you might really need to rely on external experts in the field or academics as well. And then we also have functions such as where we sit in the organisation around portfolio management, who don't have that specific knowledge of the drug or the trial design, but have a sense of what the company is doing and their strategic decisions and a view of the entire collection of drugs. So to give you a couple of quick examples, I think historically we saw a lot of this combination. So taking portfolio management, needing to come up with a value of risk. This is particularly important for their work, trying to come up with risk-adjusted financial metrics, for example. So without that underlying detailed knowledge of the project, industry benchmarks and judging which benchmark is appropriate becomes a reasonable estimate for risk.
And I think most companies now have moved away from using this as a standard in the later stages of development, but still in earlier stages of development, this is a common approach. As Katie was outlining, the number of kind of the scale of projects that you're talking about at that stage is very high, and there isn't necessarily data to do anything more, data or time in order to do anything more sophisticated. As you get further through the development pipeline, obviously you start to impact people, more patients, and you start to also see considerable increases in the amount of cost that are outlaid at that point in time. And so typically the kind of more advanced elicitation methods are used for those later stages of development.
Yeah, that's fair, very fair. And then just one more to give a sense of perhaps you're working in those early phases, but you've got a bit more time available to you. Can you start having a discussion with a project team? But typically you might see it facilitated by someone from portfolio management, or we have a group known as decision scientists here to facilitate these discussions with the project team. But at this point, it might be easier to have a dialogue about the risk directly, so eliciting of the probability, because you don't yet know exactly what your trial design and the endpoints within that might look like. So there are two examples. So from this, I think we just wanted to give a sense of the variety of methods that are being used and the situations, and really the who. So there's two questions that David will take you through that we wanted to get out of this topic.
So the first key element as we're thinking about eliciting risk is who can inform the actual elicitation process, who are typically the people involved in that component, and then secondly, who ultimately decides on what the final number is that the organization uses. And typically most organizations would use the project teams, i.e. those who are the mixture of individuals who are responsible for the progression of a given asset or drug or medicine, as the elicitation body, potentially with some additional external experts also providing some influence, because they are obviously closest to kind of the biological mechanisms as well as kind of the specific competitive area. Those project teams are multifunctional groups, including kind of commercial, regulatory, as well as kind of the development teams and biostatistics and others as well. So all of those would be involved in the project teams. Where we tend to see more differences between companies is in where the decision sits around what the final probability is that's used. And I think this example on the right shows two of the common approaches. One of those is essentially that the belief that ultimately the PTRS or probability of success that you are eliciting is the decision maker's probability of success, and therefore the decision maker ultimately has the accountable responsibility for it. And so if there are any edits versus what the project team produce, then the decision maker has the authority ultimately just to say, I overwrite that, and this is what it will be. And that decision maker often is, you know, the head of development or the head of R&D or something of that nature. The other approach which some companies use is to have a completely separate body, which is a calibration body, who are there entirely to ensure that the probabilities of success which are arised at come from are as unbiased as possible, are as consistent across the organization as possible, and those sorts of things. And in those instances, they would have the final authority in terms of what the actual number is. Now, there's advantages and disadvantages to both of these approaches, but I think it raises an interesting question around what actually is this probability of success, and what does it mean for an organization. And so they're two of the common approaches that come up.
And maybe just on the bottom one, I'm thinking, reflecting now, that it may not be that the project teams even provide a recommendation. They're just the sources of information, if you like, that is then submitted to the calibration body. So I've heard of it being both ways, that they do a judgment and it's gone into the mix with other pieces of information available, or they are providing pure information and no judgment of the risk themselves.
Cool. Now, as you can imagine, the use of expert judgment here typically, and decisions around who the right parties involved are and the right mechanisms that you might use in order to do the elicitation, people typically want to have some sort of data to base that decision on, and so the kind of the calibration of this elicitation is obviously a hot topic within the pharmaceutical industry. I think one of the common approaches that is used for doing this is kind of what's described at the top right here, in terms of just simply plotting the elicited probabilities against the observed success rates and seeing where they lie on that line. And many companies use that approach, and potentially Briar scores and other things, in order to get a sense of how well calibrated they are. I think obviously one of the big challenges in doing this for an organization is often that the timeline for these events actually to be realized is really long, and in some of the cases, as you saw, as Katie was describing earlier, you might be looking at even 10 years through the clinic into registration. And so getting a sense of how accurate your probability of success was in any given under any given methodology is quite difficult, because typically the methodologies are evolving faster than the actual readout of the results. And so thinking through how we calibrate is often a critical question. And I think one of the common discussions at the moment I hear in the industry is around the use of AI and ML, and this I think speaks to this challenge of the pace of methodologies changing faster than the actual data becoming available to understand whether they are viable or not. Is we often hear, can we just not use AI and ML for this instead of using elicitation? Surely there must be a big data solution in order to just kind of spit out these probabilities of success for us to use. And there are many companies that will actually try to produce AI and ML solutions to produce these probability of successes. I think part of the challenge that we see with this is one that typically, obviously these methodologies rely on lots of data in order to enable them, but actually some of the spaces we might be working are quite unique, don't have a lot of historic data. Almost by definition, you are creating a novel drug, and therefore how relevant is some of the information that might be available to the situation you might be in is always one of the challenges. The second piece is that often these solutions will be very focused on forecasting a given clinical trial success. So the success of a kind of the very next step in the journey, where actually for us as an organization, that's a critical point, but almost more critical is all the steps after that next step. And actually, there typically aren't many AI and ML solutions for that. And so one of the things that we'd be very interested in hearing afterwards in the discussion is this a common theme where we see that expert elicitation is getting challenged, either rightly or wrongly, for kind of interchanging with AI and ML solutions?
Okay, so far we have talked more about where elicitation and expert judgment is used at that project level. So you're working on a particular drug. But as we said in the introduction, the space at which David and I are operating at is higher than that within the organisation. So what we call the portfolio level, the collection of drugs across our organisation. So I've used the image here on the right to try and demonstrate that these things are all connected, and that there's different levels of attention being paid to these types of questions and problems. And so far, I'd say at the centre of this, those clinical trial level questions. So what's the chance of succeeding in the study I'm running at the moment, given I've seen a little bit of data and interim analysis so far? Those kind of questions, we've got really advanced either closed form or simulation-based methods to assess and get a lot of attention across organisations and across industry. But as you move almost to those outer rings, maybe you're thinking at a project level. I've put an example here on the right. Does our confidence in psoriatic arthritis increase if we get positive data in psoriasis? These two indications have similar pathology. Often drugs do work in both. And so can we describe that relationship is one key question, one that doesn't get a lot of methodology attention on the best way to approach that, but certainly gets a lot of discussion across the business. And then if we go even one step higher to this portfolio level, you could think there's questions along the lines of, well, if we get our first approval in a particular disease area like immunology, are we more likely to get further successes in the future? So to give you an example, GSK has historically been very heavy in respiratory as a company, and where we've had successes in the past. You could argue that our chance of getting a new respiratory drug to market is higher than that of another company because of that past experience. So some challenges that I've seen coming into this space, particularly around the things that get in your way. You've got just practicalities of company structure. We're not all talking to each other across all therapeutic areas, and that's certainly the case across every company that I've worked with in industry. Those kind of organizational silos don't help the cross project thinking that you need to address these project level or portfolio level questions. And there's often, as David alluded to, a lack of either precedency for these methods or time available to address them. And so things that are more light touch and quicker are often the ones that are going to have more traction. And the second point that these questions help speak to is there's a really interesting but complex and multifaceted dependence structure that occurs across a portfolio of drugs. And that isn't something that's fixed over time. And that's something that I think is a real challenge for us to try and not just describe a system, but a system that's moving with time. And so we've got 2 points to raise along these 2 challenges.
Cool. So I think the first challenge that we see at a portfolio level, as Katie was alluding to, is kind of the scale that often we need to elicit or work at in order to answer meaningful questions. And so I think a common question that came up across the industry, as you can imagine, during the pandemic is, what impact do we expect from COVID-19 lockdowns in terms of our trial end date? So as you can imagine, those lockdowns impacted the recruitment onto various trials, which elongated the lengths of those trials, which had impacts in a whole host of different ways. And so as an organisation, as other organisations across the industry wanted to get a sense of, what the impact of that would be. And the first challenge in this is, as Katie was alluding to, we have lots of different project teams who are kind of independently, to a certain extent, working on the progression of their individual medicines, and they have the best understanding of the progression of those particular elements, and how recruitment is being impacted through these lockdowns, because it will vary. it varied majorly between oncology versus respiratory type problems in terms of access and things like that. And so the first big challenge that came up in this instance was around framing the problem. So how in this scenario do we ensure that as we ask the question about the potential impacts on end dates, that everyone's using the same assumptions around what the impact of COVID-19 or what the likely outcomes of COVID-19 lockdowns would be, how long they would last. Were people projecting that it would become endemic or not, and all these sorts of things. So there was a big effort to ensure that people were looking at a consistent question and had a consistent framing around what's the actual problem that we're trying to solve for. The next kind of challenge was, how do we elicit from a lot of people, hundreds of projects, thousands of people potentially impacted across the organization, how do we elicit from all of those individuals a viewpoint on what the impact would be in a way that we know manages all of the important things that come up in elicitation problems? How do we manage bias? How do we do all of those important things when we don't necessarily have direct access to all of the individuals who will be involved in the elicitation exercise? The other kind of major challenge, which then links partially back to that, but also partially back to the timing component, is that there's limited opportunity for multiple cycles with these individuals in order to validate responses or to apply feedback checks because of the time pressures and the speed that things were operating under during the pandemic. And so how did we ensure that we kind of got it right first time as we were going through these things? And I've used COVID-19 as an example here because I think it nicely highlights the challenge, but actually these are often common problems that you see at a portfolio level, which is, your access to the key elicitors may not be as comprehensive as you would like, and you need to understand that their kind of core role in the organization is to perform a different duty than just providing you information. And so how do you ensure that they are motivated, incentivized, and able through time or otherwise in order to provide that in a meaningful way in order to support portfolio problems?
Okay, and then thinking about that second challenge we referred to was around the dependent structures. I thought it might be helpful just to give a sense of, or some examples of some of those. So this is a snapshot of GSK's pipeline at some point in the distant past, or not so distant past, that's publicly available. So just to point at some sources of dependence that we might get across a portfolio of drugs. So here I've highlighted, we've got, there's a vaccine known as RSV. You can see two of the orange boxes. We've got pediatric and older adults in the middle column, but then there's also RSV maternal in the right-hand side, which is in a later phase. So what we've got here is different populations of patients all being treated with the same vaccine. And so if the first turns out to be negative and not successful, most likely there would be a company decision to not pursue the smaller indications of pediatrics or older adults, or it wouldn't be seen as ethical to do so. So there's a really explicit dependency there on how you'd create a structure of which populations to pursue. Another example, just thinking more generally about the vaccines then, is that vaccines do offer quite similar risk and benefit profiles as a whole. And so there's a relationship there about the ease of approval, for example, or the fact that you don't get the same competitive or patent issues in the vaccine space as you do for a drug. So there's some overarching similarities there, both on the risks and the benefits for an organization to consider. And then a third option, I mentioned respiratory projects before. So if this is an area for GSK has been a very successful area in the past, we have a lot of knowledge, a lot of internal expertise in the respiratory space. So when developing new indications, we've likely got a much better pool of people to work through those judgment-based questions with and rely on that past experience, which will aid us and create some association between these projects as well. So it's complex and does manifest in multiple different ways. Typically what we see is, if you like, the easy approach being used across portfolio to assume projects are independent. Where we can start to map this out in slightly more complex ways is when we're not dealing with such a large pool of projects, and you perhaps have that time to work with a team to understand their development plan, or the structure, if you like, of the dependency across a particular program or small collection of programs.
So yes, so as Katie was describing, often organisations are very good, or certainly better, at doing the elicitation for individual and independent programs. I think as it becomes to that dependent structure, it becomes harder because of the number of people that need to be involved, and just where organisational knowledge sits actually about some of the links between these things is not necessarily always known to an organisation, even in itself, and so that certainly becomes a challenge. I think the other piece is just related to the time involved for doing the elicitation, is that often these numbers are changing with some sort of frequency, which makes kind of elicitation quite challenging, because we have a moving problem that we need to manage. And a simple example of this, which is our kind of annual goals, or annual goals that organizations have, is typically they have a time-based component. So normally, if we think about the probabilities of success that we've described so far, they're just probabilities kind of independent of time. It's the probability of ever making it to approval. When we think about setting annual goals, obviously those are kind of restricted to a given calendar, and so we'll be interested in what's the probability of something happening by a particular point in time, where we've got a decreasing time window, obviously, as we get closer to that end point of whenever goals are measured, and obviously at that point in time we'll have data that's coming over time. I think what we find is a challenge as we're going through that is ensuring that we are eliciting from individuals something that we can meaningfully use to identify how those elements are changing over time, so that we can have a clear picture at a portfolio level, if we're interested in March, exactly across all of our projects in the portfolio, what's the probability of hitting our end of year goals. We need to understand what data and information we've accumulated on a project by project basis, and how do we do that without kind of repeatedly going back to kind of some of these stakeholders to elicit it on a monthly, weekly, whatever basis, and create too much burden in the organisation. It's often a challenge. Cool. So I appreciate we've done a lot of talking here, and we've touched quite lightly on quite a large number of things that relate to expert judgment. But I think the key conclusions from our side are, expert judgment is something that's very actively used across the pharmaceutical industry. Pretty much all organisations use it. It's adding a lot of value, and particularly at a clinical trial level. I think demand is ever increasing for answers to more complex portfolio level questions, and I think those produce new burdens on an organisation, both in terms of the complexity of those questions, and therefore the approaches that needed to be used in order to answer them, but also from a time and organisational perspective in terms of the amount of investment, and how do we balance those versus other priorities, which, as you can imagine, all of these individuals in the organisation have. And so understanding how we can effectively use elicitation techniques in this space is key to our success as organisations overall. And so I think some of the questions that I think came out as me and Katie were talking through this in advance, that it'd be really interesting to hear other people's thoughts on today, is, for decision quality, who is best placed to judge the information? How do we build trust in elicitation processes in the absence of quantitative validation? And critically, how do we make decisions around changing methodologies in the absence of quantitative validation? What to focus on when conducting large-scale quick elicitation? So when we need to do something at mass scale, how do we put in the minimal framework that delivers the maximal value in terms of proper elicitation techniques? As we think about managing this dependency correlation structure, you know, in an ideal world, we'd potentially have a Bayesian network of our whole portfolio, but in practice, how would we identify actually what are all of the nodes and points that we need to include in there? And any thoughts that people have about what do we need to watch out for, or what can be useful as we're thinking about elicitation, particularly of variables that occur over time. So we'll stop talking there. Hopefully that's provided, if nothing else, at least some food for thought, and we'll be very interested in people's thoughts on some of these questions. Thank you.